welcome everybody. Welcome to AVA Gallery and Art Center. If you don't know me, I'm Trip Anderson, the relatively new executive director here. I think I'm, 13 and a half months on the job. So welcome, thank you for giving up part of what's turned into a sunny Saturday afternoon. A little different from yesterday. Looking forward to hearing Sarah talk about all these wonderful ceramics. But before we do, I just have to pitch our workshops in our ceramic studio across the parking lot. Class registrations for the winter are well underway. So please consider that, taking a class here. And also, we have been the benefactor of a number of very significant bequests in the last 30 or 45 days, and it has enabled us to substantially booster our scholarship, our financial aid support if you want to take classes. So there are scholarships available, there is a form and there is a process for applying, but I just wanted to let you all know that there is also substantially more scholarship assistance available if you have that need. So welcome again, and without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mila Pinnigan, our exhibition manager and the person who put this all together with Jen Lay. So Mila, come introduce our artist.
Thank you, Trip. Hi, everyone. My name is Mila Pinnigan, and I'm so glad you're all here today to hear Sarah's talk. Sarah Heimann is a studio artist in Lebanon, New Hampshire, right here, and she is also an instructor at Dartmouth College's Ceramic Studio. Her work has been published in Lark's 500 Cups, 500 Vases, 500 Teapots, Studio Potter magazine, as well as Surfaces, Glazes, and Firing by Angelica Pozzo. Her awards have included a McKnight Artist Residency, Jerome Artist Project Grant, and a McKnight Artist Fellowship. She, as an MFA, she received her MFA in ceramics from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. It was a wonderful process to work with Sarah on putting the show together. Handling her work, you just really get to explore every centimeter, which is just full. You can just see all of the time and care that she puts into each piece, and it was really just such a pleasure. So without any further ado, Sarah Heimann.
Thank you, Mila. You'll tell me if I'm too quiet or too loud, I trust. And I'm not used to standing in one sort of corner, so we'll see how this goes, okay? This has been a dream of mine to have a show in this space for years. When I moved here in 2001, years and years ago, my friend Liz, who was here last night, said, Sarah, you have to get a show at AVA because that's how people will know what you actually do. Because I show work at the farmer's market, small work that you can move and you put it on your table. So you bring maybe one larger piece. So there's a snapshot, but it's a snapshot of a corner of your work. And that is exciting, but even more exciting has been the opportunity to imagine a room and imagine a space. The work you see in this room is work that started with, indeed, the McKnight. I got a McKnight Artist Residency in 2014. You know that thing, and I'm guessing anyone who's lived any amount of time, you get stale. You get to this point where you're like, okay, I know what I'm gonna do in the studio. And I got there. My pieces were very thin and very delicate. And some of you in the room have picked them up when they were like that. They felt like fragile seashells. And because I'd gotten to that point, I could carve something that was very, very thin without too much problem. And then I thought, well, that's stressful. Like I was watching the way people touch the work. It was like a fine teacup. You know how you turn your finger and you're like, ooh, I don't want to crack it. If I hold onto that handle too tightly, I'm going to break it. And that began to feel not like who I wanted to be. And of course, our work is part of that. And so I had this idea. I needed to step sideways. And so I wrote this grant. You know, it was February. That's when you do it, right? You're like, oh my God, get me out of here. And you look, what are the grants? What can I do to get my, and you know, you're always broke. You're an artist. You got to figure out a way. So I wrote a proposal and got it in 2014 to go to Minnesota and to make big work, which was something I'd really never done before. And I thought, well, let's make it even harder. I'm a thrower. Let's coil build. Not something I'm particularly good at. So I was like, all right, let's do that. And the work, and at the time, I had this idea of these ovals. So this was the beginning of what I was doing. And so they were a form. So I got this grant. I got to go from, when was I there? April through June, end of June. So I had 3 months, which is, it was like a sabbatical for a working potter. It was incredible. And so one of the first pieces I made was this here. I came with molds and I said, all right, I just want to work on my drawing. I want to figure it out. And so I asked, what if? There was a big building. It was like a garage space, and there was a big building, one of those, you know, 500 people live in this building, sort of lots of windows. And so, of course, that goes into your work. Whatever's there goes into your work. And I wanted to make something that was massive. Well, at the time, this felt very massive. So I made this work, and I started with this drawing. And what I wanted to find out was edges and how to layer images. Not just draw them, but find out what was behind. That's always been my interest, because I'm a carver, I'm a thrower, but really for me, the thing that's interesting is what happens afterwards. So I generate these forms, and then I begin to go forward. So I made this drawing, and then I thought, oh, okay, what if I put something on top, if you can see through the drawing? So this was one idea. I made this piece at the same time. So you'll see, I think, there's a curve, and there's a hole here. So again, this idea of how do I see through, how do I get there? How deep can I go? How thick can I make it? Also, how in heaven's name do I make something that a not too big person, strong enough, but not like super strong, how can I move this around? Well, my answer was to make it super thick, which of course I regretted when I had to put it down into a kiln, which is about this high, and I was like, that wasn't like my most brilliant move, but I wanted something that felt monumental. And so this was one answer to monumental, okay? This idea of going back and forth, using the buildings as legs also. Here, cutting through. So you can see here, this is, again, this idea of a grill that you can see through, or cutting through. When you look closely, on the side here, I've cut through. There's a cut through, which is, of course, a mixed blessing, because what that means is it's clay. The clay is going to twist, and it may or may not come out of the firing as you intended it. So that was like a downside that I discovered. And this has been a back and forth. Like, what's the edge of what I can do with a particular clay body? You know, some are very gritty, and you'll see in this studio, I always think in terms of studio, in this room, that I have marked some pieces as raku clay, and I've said some are stoneware clay, and then I've said some are cone sticks. Who cares? What does that mean if you're not a clay person? What it means is I'm talking about different types of grittier clay and less gritty clay. And so some reads as more sparkly and less sparkly, depending on the bits of previously fired clay that are mixed into the clay body. Does that make sense? Okay, okay. So I started with this. This was thin. This felt more monumental. It's small, but it's, can you see how I've carved down deep into it? Okay, I was really pleased with this opportunity to cut something and to create something that was very sculptural on both sides. However, perhaps you can imagine the challenge that came next. So I came home, I had a show, and the long-suffering, marvelous gallery director said, Sarah, how am I going to show this? And I thought, oh no. And, and I said, could you put it on the wall? And he said, well, you know, and he has, you know, how many shows does a gallery director do? Any number. And what do people do in their homes? Unless you provide them with some answer to this problem, like perhaps I suddenly take up metalwork and create something to put that on, I could do that, because I actually saw these as wall pieces, because this is how I was drawing them. They sit here and it's interesting and I like it, but this piece is actually much more effective like this than it is down like this. So this was a problem that I had back in 2014 that my friend Liz, with whom I work, said to me, this was like this summer, she said, you know, Sarah, those ovals, why don't you build walls for them? Why don't you make them so that they sit in some way? So this was my next answer. So here we are in 2014, a thin one, going thicker, and these are all ovals, you can see. I'm interested in the tension of what goes on in terms of drawing, but this was my next answer. And I was like, okay, what are you going to do? And so my answer, because I read books all the time. My mother's a librarian. You know, she was a librarian. So I go to the library. When in doubt, find a book, ask everyone you know, and see what you can do. So my answer then was to create these keyholes, which I think it's a nice, they're not too bad. I'm looking at Mila right now. But they're, you know, and so this is my next answer. I think in 3 more years, perhaps I'll have another answer that will be, because I really like the back of this, and I want it to be usable. So the cutting is okay, but I want it to be more elegant. I'm constantly looking for elegance in something, because I really like the pillow. I'm like, oh, wouldn't this be great? Like, I want things that exist in space. Like, I get the opportunity, and I think probably many of you who are artists do, I get invited to these amazing houses, which are filled with beautiful things, just beautiful, and they're designed to show them off. I live in a barn, and it's a wonderful barn, but it is a barn. It's an apartment that sort of was cobbled together, over a number of years. And so my ceilings are low. My rooms came from, it's a cow barn. So my studio is, 10 foot by 12 foot, and it's 2 of those rooms. And then I have I'm very fortunate in what I have. But what I find is that, making something like this in my own studio would not have been possible, because I couldn't step back far enough to see it. I made a piece when I came home from Minnesota. So in the winter of 2015, I made a bigger piece, and I stepped back, I thought, but then after firing it so I could put it out in the world, my drawing, I hadn't gone back and forth with my drawing enough. So I thought, okay, because the drawing was really good up close. There's always a space, which, if you look at all of these, you can see that, what do? I get on my jeweler's hood. Kirsten probably knows the name for that, but the thing that goes over your face and you can magnify things. I put that on and I look and I think about what's going below something else. I layer it. I spend a lot of time thinking about that and scraping and shining my light on it. But I don't step away that often. And so that's the opportunity that like a show like this offers me, is stepping back. Even when I do like a craft show, which is often I'm with potters, but we have a tiny space. It's like my space more often than not, and I'm so grateful to have it, let me be clear, but is, about this big, so, and I'm talking to people, so I'm not outside. So it's so interesting to me. So this question of what I'm doing, this was one answer, this oval that hangs. And I like what happened, but this was another. I wanted to take away utility completely. And so this became another. And so you see a variety of iterations. A drawing that goes on the other side, a secret that's there. Because at first I was like, oh, so some of these actually don't have carving on the back. The carving stops right here. Because I was like, oh great, I don't have to do that. I can get rid of this compulsion. No, I cannot. I could do it on one. And then I was like, wait a minute, I could go further. I could make this better. And so I'm so enamored of this moon here. I mean, this is so pleasing to me now. So, and I also, when I was in undergrad, I was at the University of Arts for a couple years. I was a special student, and I remember people talking. People get very, you know how when you're 20 you get really head up about stuff. And people were very, very clear that they did not want their pictures to be used for flower vases. That's like a classic Potter thing, or whatever that might be. But I thought, I don't know that I'm always the best judge of my work. There's what I love because it came out. And I just came out, so I'm really engaged in it. And then there's what I see. Maybe a year or two later, I actually can see, I can let go of what I imagined. And I can actually see what is, or maybe my eye has been sharpened by some art that I've seen. And it takes a while for that to happen. And so I'm trying to set up these wall pieces, which are very new. I mean, this is just this year that these, it takes me that long to get to basically a piece of paper, but so be it. I wanted to give opportunities for them to hang in any number of ways, so that whomever had it, I hadn't limited that. I wanted it to be a bit of a potential collaboration, because that's how pots are in the world. Though I'm really proud of that I read a book and it showed me how to do this. I was very pleased with myself, because usually it's a pain in the butt, and this is not too bad as a potter. So, okay, let's check on how I'm doing here. Let's see. Oh, okay. This is the problem with having been a professor at one point in your life. I could take up the whole hour, and I'm not going to do that. But I do want to talk about another thing, of course. So I want to talk a little bit about, this monumental stacking piece. I cut it here because this is the size that it fits in an electric kiln. As I say, as I'm going back to, it was a challenge to move it in and out. And I wanted to understand how things stack and come together better, and to work in parts, which is where this summer I was teaching. I teach in the student workshops at Dartmouth, and in the summer it's a little quieter. So there's an opportunity to have like one project that you work on a little bit. You go back and forth to it while the students are there, but it was this. I had this window, and it allowed me to think differently. And so I started making these stacked pieces. And I want something that's difficult. And what was difficult about it was that I had to think about the drawing. And actually, I'm going to walk over here, because this is the first one I did. So right here, you can see it. what does it look like? It looks like a bamboo steamer, right? Nothing like so much, at least a lot of people see that. And I threw it, you know, in 3 parts, and then I added the bottom. Of course, I carved the bottom, and that was really fun sculpturally. And of course, I did, you know, the top. So, because I like the idea, I'm so enamored of this idea of something that has a couple of lives. This particular form was my first one, and I didn't think far enough about it. But I thought, oh, you could put like precious jewelry, or I know I did this wonderful trade with Kirsten, who's in the room at one point, and she kept like precious gems in a little jar I made. It was a great trade. And I just imagined that this could be 3 pieces that could live as one also. That it could be, you could serve something in this. You could use it. It has another life. And then, after doing that, I realized, oh my God, I stopped right here. So this one and the one that was on the card that's over there, they're flat. You know, and then I thought, oh, wait a minute. I had so much fun with this bottom. I thought, and I was looking at this. I made this early in the summer. So I was at Sunapee, this big craft show I do. So I had time to look at it. And then my next thought was, well, I'm just going to show you, what if I I lift it up off the bottom. Now it's more pot-like. Pluses and minuses to that. The jury's still out. I don't know what I'll think in 3 years about that. But I love this idea of doing these, and so the drawing has to work on this piece, but then it has to work together. The decision about, is it quiet, and that's my little note in there, is it quiet inside, black, so you fall into a pool, or is it white? It's an opportunity for, these are Potter questions, but they're also sculptural questions, like what do you do inside? And I just love, these just make me really happy. This is so pleasing, that cut there. The question, what happens to that ladder? Where does it go? And this is the last thing I just want to briefly touch on, which is, iconography is a big word, but, I started out with these forms, which when I looked at them, I was like, oh, that's a building. Was it a building intentionally? No. I wanted something structural to create a tension with the organic forms. If you look at my work from many years ago, it's all organic, it's very soft, it's very squishy. And then I wanted some tension. And when I drew these lines and I realized I could make them dimensional, they started looking like buildings. I didn't realize it until I just reread this yesterday, but in an article someone had written about me, just an essay, they were talking about my buildings, and they were saying, they look like grids or ladders, and I hadn't thought about ladders, really. And they were talking specifically about this piece here, which is the first place where this actually comes, where you might see that. And that stayed in my head and came out this summer when I was teaching a workshop. And I said, well, what happens if I do this? Because I wanted something that you could see through. So here's the top of a ladder, here's a building coming up, there's a moon over the top of it. And I liked that image of some ladders are something you go down, you go up. They're in a way, it's a passageway, or it's a way to somewhere. Just as a chair indicates a body, that a body was there, or a body is intended to be there. Those are the things that interest me. So that's a very brief answer, not even answer. So I'd say my biggest question that I keep asking myself, and I think probably every artist asks himself, is my work changes slowly, but I know it changes. And the most interesting question is, well, what if? Like there's those two coil pieces right there, the oval and the square, come from, this summer, we have these molds at work. They're just like these square forms. And I was teaching coil building and I thought, what happens if I take this base and see what happens? Well, that square piece there, I made it, and like in a dream later, I realized that it is a form that a studio mate of mine, maybe 25 years ago, made cups this size, that if you put them side by side, I was remembering his cup that long time ago. And it's become part of what I did. So that's just odd. You know, this is how ideas come through, I guess, for me. I'm trying to think, let's see. Yeah, so I'm trying to think what else. I think I'm going to open it to questions, if that's okay. Do you have any questions for me or things? Yes.
Your stackable pieces, have you made any that you can change the order of the stacks and have the drawing still work?
I haven't intentionally. Not that I have intentionally not done that. I don't. You can see that right now they angle like this. So I have not. They're all angled this way. That is an excellent question, and I may, because you've asked that question. Just like a woman asked me a couple years ago, she said, well, why are they always moons? And I was like, oh God, I have no idea. That's a really good question. And it's because I think of Japanese screens where they have that gold moon, and so that's the direct reference. But I like the question. I like your question. I don't have a, right now, I've sort of let go of the oval in terms of this, but there's more tension in a form like this than straight like that. That one's got a little less tension than this one, I would say. It's a good question. Other questions? Dave.
How all the carving and all the imagery on them, I'm just, and they're clay obviously, but I'm wondering about the relationship between the imagery and the material, and how do you feel about how clay relates to what you're doing as far as the drawing?
It's a good question. Yeah, you know, it's one of those questions that I probably should wrestle with, because I don't exactly wrestle with it. Clay is the medium I am comfortable in. I have thought a lot about, here's the should. I should be carving wood or ivory, because that's where my reference points come from. A lot of what when I started in grad school, when I started doing a lot of work on surface, I was working at the same time in the print shop. And I was making woodcuts, and I was doing intaglio, and that's the direct. And a lot of what I'm pulling from is that. I guess it's funny because I'll teach a workshop, and someone will say, "What type of clay do you want?" And I think, I don't care. Give me clay, and what I care about is the carving. It's the action. I think I'm much more. It's sort of like. The reason I don't do, I'd love to do, if someone gave me a residency, please, I would love to work really large and have someone else technical help me with that. But I've never had the dream of having a barn full of my work. Like I'm a potter in that way. I think that's part of it. As a potter, your work goes away, mostly. And you can break it if it doesn't at a certain point, you know, and I want to be engaged in the making. So I'm not really answering your question, but I think that the question's a good one, it'll stick with me.
Maybe it has something to do with production.
Yeah, I'm someone, one of my students talks about, he's like, I'd be a very good factory worker. He says, because he likes repetition, I get a lot of pleasure out of having a board of bowls. That's why these stacking pieces are so pleasing to me, because it takes, 8 parts to make a 3-part stack, that's really pleasing. It takes more work because I'm throwing the bottom separately. I'm throwing the lid. You know, the lid is 2 parts that I put together because that's more interesting. And so that I used to be a baker, you know, same thing. It's all of a piece.
So Sarah, all of this is like thick clay that you carve into. You don't put any like pieces on top ever?
You
Like
know,
that ladder, for instance?
that is a project I want to do. I have not. There's an artist whose work is amazing. If any of you have ever have an opportunity to look at George Mason's work, doesn't do as much clay work now. He works with clay. Now he works with, I think, forgive me, George, but I think it's burlap or canvas, and he fills it with, he does a lot of printmaking processes. But years ago, when I was at Watershed, so this would have been in the early 90s, he was making these pieces which were layered clay, and he would cut the clay. It was like each layer would be cut. So think about printmaking or something like that. You know, you layer it on top so you can see through. Totally influenced, like that was in my head as I went to graduate school. But I didn't, and he would cut apart paper and then figure that out for the way he would work with clay. And then he sometimes would make a mold. This was the most direct way. I think for me, still reductive is the easiest way. I mean, truly, Karen, this is as far as I've gotten. Or the behind, right back there, that one taller piece has an added moon and it's cut through. But it's something that's still in my head. Look for it in about 3 years, I'll probably figure it out. That's when I'll have figured out the keyholes too. I'll be on the next iteration of that. Oh, the other thing I didn't say, but I said to some people, the other reason that the stacked pots came about was because I was in a show, which actually I'm curating, which is super fun. The Worcester Center for Crafts has a Potter's Invitational every year. And so this is one of those where, again, I have this little space and I'm standing there, and the woman who was beside me is this very fine potter named Maya Machin. I'm probably butchering her last name, but she makes these beautiful stacked jars. And I looked at them and I spent the weekend, so this is like Friday night through Sunday afternoon, so that's kind of a lot of hours, looking at them, and they were four stack, and I thought, oh, I want to do that. And so thank you, Maya. You know, because we're all thieves, but I'm trying to say her name whenever possible also. Hers are very simple. I mean, they're not simple. It's a complicated and sort of difficult, not for you maybe, but for me it's difficult. So that's where those came from. Any other? Yes, Chris.
I have a couple things. Please. One, having the pleasure of owning a couple of your functional pieces. Mm-hmm. What I've always loved is a combination of things: the tactile quality of a surface that I can hold on to and doesn't slip out. Right. But then the discovery of turning it upside down and seeing the continuation of that surface. Mm-hmm. And I think the stacked forms are perfect because you have the exterior, you have the interior, and each time mm-hmm. you unearth it, you are becoming engrossed in that story because the mm-hmm. narrative is marvelous. So there's that. And I think that allows the person who is experiencing it a very personal, intimate connection mm-hmm. with it. I also wonder, where is the relationship of volume to the surface mm-hmm. is something you spend so much time on, mm-hmm. but so often with potters, it's that interior volume mm-hmm. that they're not just as container, mm-hmm. but as a container of space. And even your flat pieces, mm-hmm. there is that volume. Mm-hmm. There is this a container for air, a container for narrative, you know, and I'm just curious to know, do you think about that? Are you responding to that, or is that just there?
I think about it when I am throwing pots or when I am coiling. I think about it when I make the bisque mold that I put these in to set up the, I think about it where I think about it. And it's not exactly container, but it's about air and it's about volume. If you look at these sideways, you see some curve in, some curve out, some are a little wiggled. So you can see the sort of pillowing of air or the sucking in of air. And that's, so I think about volume more as something I respond to when I'm drawing. Or edge. Liz refers to it edge, which is less volume than a drawing tension. I probably will more now. I think about it when I teach a lot. I talk about it, I think about it, and then I think I put all of that stuff aside when I go into my studio. And like a lot of you who've walked through, I mean, I listen to books on tape a lot because I have to figure out a way. This is a tedious process. I love the tedium of that. I have a great capacity for tedium, but I have to figure out some way to get keep my butt in the chair, because I'd rather go for a walk. Some of the time, I'm happiest if I'm in my studio, but to get myself in there is just hell sometimes. So I have to have a good story, or well, not so NPR so much right now, but in general, I do. And so, so yes, with these forms, not as much with these. These are like more like a mark and response, I guess I'd say. And it's unknown. It's still unknown to me, and that's what's interesting. Like I started making these, didn't come to pass, but I was at maybe that same show, but a year before, the Worcester show, and these two lovely women came. They were given the task of finding an artist to make an object, a wall of contemplation for their church. And they looked at my work and they said, oh, you might be just the person. And I was really, and we talked about it, and I gave them my contact information. It didn't come to pass, but that seed was planted in my head. And I thought, oh, I'll make 4-part. I work slowly. I mean, I make a lot, but my ideas evolve slowly. And so these, I think, like I love the way, we were talking about it when we were setting it up, like how do we pair these or not pair them? How do they work together? You know, what happens? And so I'm thinking about that probably more than volume with these pieces.
Do you start with a drawing or a print and then make the work afterwards?
I usually start with, I draw in my studio, and sometimes it's on my table because I have pencils, you know, and I have a collection of pencil sharpeners, which makes me really happy so that I can control for that. But yeah, I do. I draw, or if I'm making plates, I'm going to draw on my bats and figure it out. And then I work, you know, in some ways it's the same drawing and it's completely the different drawing. I mean, these are all, you can see what I'm thinking about here. And to me, and I can never decide if you decide that, but if it's good or bad, but you know, like, oh, this, you know, a smaller moon, well, this one's going to be bigger. This was like a revelation to me, the sort of moon with a back, not a moon, I'm talking about the building actually, it goes backwards. So this and this are similar but very different. Like, so this is not, it's almost a ladder but not quite. This cut here, there's one on the back wall by Mila which cuts quite a bit. And I'm really enamored of that right now. also how things overlap. Like I spend a lot of time flattening or curving leaves, like bringing them down so that they read like something else. Very fun. Yeah.
Would you say that they're improvisations?
I think if I was a musician, I would say that. Yeah, I mean, I live with a musician. And I mean, yeah, in the way that a standard is, you know the tune, I'm choosing the tune, usually I'm choosing the number. Like I'm like, okay, this is 2 or this is 3. Or I'm thinking about the anchors, the moons, like, okay, this is gonna have 2 moons, this one's gonna have, okay, so we're working with 2 here. Right now in my studio, I'm working on, as a relaxation, just some tumblers. Those are 3. And, or I'm thinking about the underside with those. I tend to have one focus or another, which could be like seen as a different instrument. So yeah, I would say that. It's not, yeah.
Well, it seemed like you were dancing around that a little bit without saying it.
Yeah, I mean,
A lot of intuitive, some of the questions were very kind of analytical, but this seems to be very intuitive based.
well, I think that people ask me sometimes, someone asked me, do the books on tape you listen to change what you do? How, or the news or whatever you're listening to, does that change? I think in a sideways way, in the way that we're all sponges, they do to some extent, but it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. I'm glad. Yeah.
Can you talk about your glazing a little bit?
Sure. I mean, these are closest to prints, really. The carving, so let's see. You can see the color of the clay. This is a sort of a clear underneath. It's a bright white. This piece you can see so I carve it and then I paint it with a colored clay, all right? It's called a slip. This is very thin. It's actually a terra sigillata and a finer grained slip. Pattern through so I do the foreground first. I pattern through that with a quite sharp tool at this point, because once the main carving's done, I need something very sharp, like a needle tool, a dissecting tool, or dental tools are nice too. And then after this is done, I paint a black. And you will see in this room, can you see how that gets a little sheen, this black? These have a little shiny black. There is a sparkle, but it's not on the black. This is a flatter black. So these are 2 different black slips, again, colored clay. This one gets a little more melt than this one. And I was really enamored of this. And then I was like, oh, now I want a flat, more charcoal-y black. So I fire it, and it's reddish and black. Then I brush on glaze. I mean, it's really fun, because I get to be a kid. You know, I just use my bamboo brushes, and I need to get into the holes. And then I take a sponge, and depending on the grain of the sponge, it'll take more or less off. Sometimes I refire it. You can see with those 2 coil-built pieces, they're sparkly and a little bit different. The black is a different color because it's the same as this, but I'm firing to a slightly hotter temperature.
Which?
The black, that's actually
Same as that?
it is, but it's fired to a different temperature. So again, the chemistry of clay it's a rabbit hole that you can just drop into. And I enjoy working with it improvisationally, indeed. I have, by dint of my job, I have access to some kilns and some materials that I might not otherwise have. So some of these big pieces, I had access to a bigger kiln. So I bounce around a little bit. Does that answer your question? Oh, and I fire them up on little bit aspirin-sized wads so that they don't stick, because there's a tiny bit of glaze on the bottom of each one of these. So I fire them up on just little bits, and that allows them to come out and not be attached to the shelves. Let's see, that there. I think the hardest thing is when I walk away from a show and I come back and things aren't lined up anymore, and I'm like, how can you not see that? It's so clear. But everyone sees differently. I mean, I think that's what's interesting to me. Or if I take off a lid to show it, and then it's distressing to people. They're like, no, that goes on there. So that's the fun part. You can set up these little experiments. I'm gonna say thank you very much, and we can walk around and talk about the pieces if you like in smaller group. Thank you very much.